The Turing test is a terrible test of intelligence, and that's primarily because it's a test of something completely disembodied. So you're only testing the kind of linguistic intelligence. Now, this, of course, is extremely relevant today because in the context of large language models, this is very much the position we're in with large language model-based chatbots. All we have is that linguistic interface with them. So we're in that exact situation. But it doesn't test for embodied intelligence, and we are first and foremost embodied creatures, and our evolutionary ancestors, a lot of their intelligence and cognitive capabilities is bound up with the ability to navigate the ordinary everyday world of physical objects and manipulate that world of physical objects.
Murray, let's define some concepts. I think the best place to start with you would be, let's define consciousness, cognition, and intelligence. Perhaps we can define and differentiate between these terms.
Okay, right, very good. Well, right from the outset, I'm not a big fan of definitions, and I'm not a big fan at all of that kind of question, define X, Y, and Z, and especially when it comes to anything philosophically interesting, then I think the whole business of trying to pin things down with definitions is a dreadful trap. So I decline. I'm not going to define any of those things. But rather, I think that we gradually narrow in on their meaning by using them. And okay, so one really important thing is that I'm very much of a Wittgensteinian. So my philosophy is very much influenced by the later Wittgenstein work from the philosophical investigations, particularly in that era. And so there, it's the idea of defining things all the time is a bit antithetical to that. So I'm definitely not going to define consciousness, but when the term comes up, then I tend to want to kind of, or when the question comes up, I tend to want to bat it away with, let's think how we use words like consciousness and all the related words like awareness and sentience and so on.
Okay, fair enough. I completely understand. Let's try and use some of these words within your work. In your work, on the representation and simulation of cognitive processes, how do you distinguish between representational and computational models of consciousness? And how does this distinction impact the development of artificial general intelligence, let's say?
Of consciousness. Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, so you brought in artificial general intelligence there and AGI, and so I think the first thing that we need to do is dissociate a little bit. The concept of intelligence or cognition from consciousness. So I think that clearly there's a relationship between cognition and consciousness. And let's not even think about AI for now. Just thinking about in humans and in other animals, then there is some dissociation between cognition and consciousness. So they're very related, but I don't think they're completely tied together. So for example, we can clearly have animals that are capable of consciousness. I would say we'll all agree that our favorite dogs and cats and beloved pets are sentient and conscious. I think we all agree, and they're capable of suffering and so on. We care about them. And there's a certain amount of cognition going on there, and that's a whole subject in itself, of course. What kind of cognition and how similar is it to human cognition, and at what points is it of a similar level, and so on. But that's a whole sort of subject. But I think we can all agree that their cognitive capabilities are not as great as those of humans. So there's a kind of disconnect there. And conversely, we can imagine, but it's a kind of bit of an empirical question, but we can imagine building an AI system which has very sophisticated cognitive abilities, but maybe isn't conscious at all, maybe is not capable of suffering in particular. Actually, those are also other things that we need to dissociate: the capacity for suffering and is only one aspect of consciousness, I would say. So again, I think we can imagine. I think consciousness is a multifaceted concept. So so we can talk about, for example, awareness of the world is one aspect of consciousness. Awareness of self is another aspect of consciousness, and that itself has multiple aspects. And then a capacity for, you know, various emotional states such as suffering and joy and whatever are that's another aspect of consciousness, and those things can be dissociated as well, I think. So now I've forgotten what your original question was, but at least we've laid some groundwork, maybe.
You know, the reason why I started with some of these questions was because I wanted to sort of prelude toward us discussing Ex Machina, because you're one of the scientific advisors for that film. It's one of my. I actually watched that film over the weekekend, just as as an enjoyable preparation for this.
Right. Yeah.
And my first thought while leaving, while walking away from the film was Ava conscious at the end of that?
Yeah, what a great question. Ex Machina, by the way. So I have to say that when I first I didn't know the correct pronunciation myself. I think when I first saw the title of the film and somebody had to point out that the Latin roots mean that it has to be Ex Machina. But anyway, Ex Machina.
That was something I actually did want to clarify. So thank you.
So is Ava conscious? Now, of course, it's a film, so we're kind of speculating. You know, there is, as it were, no fact of the matter there. And very interestingly, if you ask Alex Garland, because this is the kind of thing that we discussed, you know, a fair bit when the film was being made and after it was finished and so on, then, you know, Alex would say that he's got his views, and, you know, in his view, she is conscious, and he sometimes, and I've heard him cite the smile that she offers at the end, right at the end of the film, as she's descending the stairs, as sort of evidence that has some kind of genuine consciousness. But, you know, he'd be the first to say, but, you know, it's not down to me, even as the author, to say, of the script, to say whether she is or not. It's the kind of thing that's open to interpretation, and I think that is actually absolutely one of the reasons it's a great film, is because it is open to interpretation. He doesn't commit, actually, even though he's got his own views, as it were. He doesn't commit in the film to an answer to that question, and I think that's you know, a really important thing. In fact, many of the works of literature that I most admire leave things open like that. Some wonderful books like Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, you know, if you know, The Turn of the Screw, where, and, you know, you're never sure at the end whether the governess is actually seeing ghosts, or is kind of insane, and whether she's kind of you know, got pedophilic tendencies and right. So it's this or not, and so it's this horrible kind of mixture. You don't know, there's all these horrible things and you don't know which one is the truth, and Henry James brilliantly never ever tells you which is the truth. So it's left to us, right, to argue about it, which is kind of very interesting and fun. So the same with Ex Machina, I think. So you don't, you know, it's, the film doesn't tell you. And in fact, there was a scene that was in the original script that never appeared in the final film, where so I don't know, well, you've just seen it, so you'll remember that right at the end she goes off in the helicopter. So the helicopter lands in Nathan's estate, Nathan being the, you know, the billionaire who's developed Ava, the robot. Maybe we need to provide a plot summary for people who haven't seen it, but anyway.
Brief synopsis.
So and Ava, the robot, so she's, you know, physically indistinguishable from a human, and she's talking to the helicopter pilot, and obviously persuading him to give her a lift out of there. And in the script, it says that the original script, it says that at that point we see all these kind of strange kind of, we see inside Ava's head, in a way, right? You see the sort of you see the sounds that he's making when he's speaking. You see them as just kind of you know, sound waves and glitches and fuzzes, and you hear, and it's meant to kind of portray the inside of Ava's head, in a way. And Alex Garland has in the script this remark that it is utterly alien And so I think partly for kind of technical reasons, they didn't know how to kind of make it turn out right, because the first screening I saw had a version of that actually there, but they never appeared in the final cut. And but I thought that scene was very telling, because you see, if you'd left that in, that would have really might have made you question more whether she is conscious. But again, it's ambiguous, because she could be
makes me wish
conscious
that
in
was
one
in.
way.
You bringing that up now makes me wish that scene was in the movie, because that
would
be questioning so much more.
Yeah, I wish that scene was in the movie as well. I mean, it was a great scene in conception, but hard to kind of make work, I think, cinematically.
It was two obviously great scientific / philosophical points in the film, where they're talking about the Turing test is one of them. The other one was Mary's room. So, what are your thoughts on these two specifically? Your general idea regarding these two thought experiments.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So sure. So So the Turing test. The Turing test, I think, is a terrible test of intelligence, and maybe and that's primarily because it's a test of something completely disembodied. It's a disembodied test. So you're only testing the kind of linguistic intelligence. Now, this, of course, is extremely relevant today, because in the context of large language models, this is very much the position we're in with large language model based chatbots. All we have is that linguistic interface with them. So we're in that exact situation. But it doesn't test for embodied intelligence, and we are first and foremost embodied creatures, and our evolutionary ancestors, a lot of their intelligence and cognitive capabilities is bound up with the ability to navigate the ordinary everyday world of physical objects, and manipulate that world of physical objects, and our fellow creatures inhabit the same world as us. And so this is the like of primal importance. So the Turing test doesn't test any of those embodied capabilities. So I've always thought it was a very poor actual test. Now, of course, I'm a huge admirer of Turing, and the paper itself at the time was a work of genius, and I hugely admire the paper, and it's a terrific conversation starter, philosophically speaking, and in my view, very much influenced by Wittgenstein, actually, because the opening move that he makes in the paper is kind of the same opening move that's made in the philosophical investigations. So in the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein says basically, don't ask what the word means, rather ask how the word is used. And so he's kind of he's substituting the question you want to ask for a different question, which maybe you should ask and is more productive to ask. And Turing does exactly the same in the beginning of computing machinery and intelligence. He says, let's not ask, could a machine think, but rather let's ask this question about whether it could pass this test. So he's substituting a philosophically impossibly difficult question for one that's kind of more operationalizable, if you like. And of course, they did. Turing was attending Wittgenstein's lectures, so I do think there may be some direct influence there.
And what about Frank Jackson and Mary's experiment?
Yeah. So I really dislike that argument, I have to say, and I've never really understood why people find it remotely persuasive, because to my mind it's just all about tricksy. So it's trickery. It's linguistic trickery. It's a sort of bait and switch with language. So you're using the word knows in a certain familiar sense, and you carry on using the word knows, and then at the vital point in the argument, you've switched the way the use of the word knows, because we in ordinary English, we use the word knows in multiple different ways, and there's this clever kind of flip of you to use the word in a different way at the vital point in the argument. So we use the word, I didn't know what it was like to smell coffee, until or let's say there's some exotic scent of some flower, right? That you encounter it in some country you've never visited before, and say, "I've never smelt that, that kind of rose. Now I know what it smells like, that rose." And people always said it's so beautiful, the smell of that rose, and now I know what it smells like, and I didn't know before. So that's one kind of use of the word know. And then you can also, of course, you can say, well, I didn't really know that the brain worked in that way. I didn't really know all this stuff about the olfactory system before. Now I've read that book about neuroscience, and I know a whole lot more about the way the olfactory system works. And the whole argument turns on the fact that the same word is used there for two completely different things. It's just a trick, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm. So when Mary leaves the room, you think, what's your opinion?
So when Mary leaves the room, then certainly she does. In the second sense, she knows what it's like to see red all of a sudden, but she hasn't acquired any knowledge of the propositional sort. She hasn't quite acquired knowledge in that other way that we use the word know. And we don't have to use the word know in that first sense at all. It's not actually, doesn't actually add anything. So what's really happened is that then she has smelled, she has seen red. That's all it's saying. She has seen red. Before she hadn't seen red. Now she has seen red.
And if you created a good enough model in your brain of red in the first place, surely that's exactly what you're going to perceive once you get out.
So I don't think that it doesn't matter what she learns propositionally about red, that still doesn't change the fact that she hasn't seen red, and it's only when she walks out of the room that she sees red.
So ultimately, she does experience something new.
She experiences something new, of course, yes. But that's not. But she doesn't know anything different in the interest, in the relevant sense of knowing. I don't think so. And the thing is that that's all. The whole trick is to try and set up. Is to try and persuade us that there's this sort of metaphysically separate realm of separate facts about subjective experience, and talking about it that way, it's a sort of realm of facts and so on, which is the kind of thing Nagel does as well, of course. The purpose of the trick of using the word knows in two different ways is in order to make it seem like that there is this kind of realm of subjective facts, and there's this sort of metaphysically, additional realm of facts. So I think it's all smoke and mirrors. That's what I say.
I'm not sure if you know, Murray, but Frank Jackson has changed his view on that. So
right. So I believe I'm not sure exactly what the latest is. So yeah, what does he say?
I don't recall who I was talking to. I think I was talking to Carl Friston. I can't remember, but yeah, apparently he's shifted across. So his prior view of that Mary would experience something new is no longer the case. I think he's now flipped to the other side. So
right. I mean, I haven't kept up with exactly what he's.
Not sure exactly either, but I could be wrong. But he has apparently crossed over.
Right. Okay. Well, you see, I would say she experiences something new, but I would say that she doesn't know anything. That it's a misleading way of putting it to say that she now knows something that she didn't know before. It's the tricksy use of the word know in two different senses. I think that
I spoke to Mark Solms about this, and he changed the thought experiment a little bit. So he just said, let's make Mary blind. So Mary's a blind neuroscientist. She's never seen the color red, but she knows everything in theory. So the question is, if we now automatically give her sight, what's the difference here now in the scenario, would you say?
Well, I would say that there's nothing more to be said beyond what you said. That now she can see. And of course, she's going to have a whole world of new experiences she's never had before.
Then does this experience become the what is it like feel, qualitative, qualia, subjective feeling that people give this essence like ethereal?
Well, I mean, of course, that's the way philosophers and people who are philosophically inclined like to talk about these things, and so I would say a tentative yes to that, but it kind of all depends where the conversation is going to go, because as soon as you start talking in this kind of slightly funny way, then you're starting to go down, being led down the philosophical garden path towards dualism of one sort or another. So that's the way it goes. What's the Wittgenstein quote about, philosophy is the is the bewitchment of the intellect by means of language or something like that. So this is how it works.
Mm.
The bewitchment.
When you work on embodiment and the inner life, when you wrote that book, and your overall, you mentioned briefly the fact that we have to talk about beings with their embodied states because it plays such a fundamental role in shaping who we are as conscious beings. How far does this go for you? Does it go into the 4E CogSci realm? Do you consider inactivism as important, or extended minds as important? Where do you sort of stop with this approach?
Yeah. So I'm very sympathetic to these sort of 4E approaches. Um, uh, uh, but perhaps, I mean, it depends what different advocates of those different E's, and different combinations of them will have different views. But so it depends what their particular philosophical project is, because, for example, the extended mind. So people who are keen on the extended mind theory, sometimes that they want to say things like, well, what is mind, or what is the mind? Is it something that is confined to the head, or is it confined to the body, or does it extend out into the world? What is mind? Right? And then they'll point out that, when we start writing with pieces of paper or use tools, it's like an extension of our mind, and our minds extend into the world. And okay, this is a great point. It's an important point to think about. But if the philosophical project is to say, well, what is mind, as if there is some as if there's some answer to that question that is out there in the in the metaphysical ether or something, and to be grabbed, or in the mind of God or something like that, then I think that's a misguided philosophical project, because I don't think it works like that. I don't. So I think so all of these people make really important points, in the sense that we can sometimes, when we're thinking about minds and brains and ourselves and so on, we can very often neglect those really important aspects. But that doesn't mean to say that, philosophically speaking, the mind is ... where that extends out into the world, or it doesn't. So I think that sort of more in a way, from a kind of cognitive science point of view, it's just absolutely essential to take account of all those E's: extendedness and embodiment, and and active. So I think they make great points about what's important to take account of. Actually, I can go a bit further with the use of words, that I do think, so in particular in the case of consciousness, then I'm often very keen to emphasize the importance of embodiment when thinking about consciousness. And for me, again, that's really to do with the use of the word, because it's really only when we are speaking about our fellow creatures who inhabit the same world as us that we use a word like conscious. And when we, if we're persuaded that an animal, such as an octopus, say, is my favorite example, if we're persuaded that type of animal is conscious, and maybe we didn't think about that before, we thought perhaps it wasn't, then we're always, we're often persuaded by watching its behavior, or watching some documentary where somebody interacts with the octopuses, and, for example, or writes, like Peter Godfrey Smith has written his wonderful books about his experiences with octopuses. And so I think those embodied experiences of being with another creature, those are the things that I think really persuade us. And of course, our experience of other human beings is of the primal experience is of being in the same space as them, and interacting with them, and inhabiting a shared world where you can look at the same things and talk about the same things because you're looking at the same things, and everything else is kind of parasitic on that primal case of being with other people and other creatures. So I think that our use of the word, so again, it's not a big metaphysical claim, but it's about our use of the word is really, really intimately tied up with our being together in the world with the other creature, the other being. And so if we want to think about disembodied things like large language models, then we're really wildly extending the use of the word if we want to apply it, I think, to disembodied large language models.
I wrote a note on my phone, actually. It's got Ex Machina, Consciousness Exotica, and then I wrote a big circle saying the space of possible minds. Do you want to open this up for us and just open us a nice, wonderful conversation?
Yeah, so that phrase, the space of possible minds, which is due to Aaron Sloman, is one of my favorite phrases in the world. So, and in fact, I've recently I realized, because I've in my career I spent a lot of time looking at all kinds of different things. You know, I've done philosophy, I've done computer science and AI. I mean, my background is in computer science and AI, my formal training. You know, and I've published on neuroscience, and I've shifted around different things. And so what do people say? What do you work on? And I think, oh God, how do I work on it? I mean, you know, I just done so many, but I realize now that the perfect phrase for this is that I am interested in understanding cognition and consciousness in the space of possible minds, which is the subtitle of my book, 2010 book. But that's exactly what I'm interested in. So I'm interested in the space of possible minds. So where that, of course, is Aaron Sloman's phrase, but the point is that it encompasses not only minds as we know them, the minds of humans, the whole range of different humans, of course, but also other animals, of course, and the minds of, you know, extraterrestrial creatures that might be out there on other planets, the minds of things that might have evolved on this planet but never did, and artificial intelligence that we may or may not be able to build, or the other civilizations elsewhere in the universe may or may not be able to build. So the space of possible minds encompasses all of those things. So in the same way that philosophy has always kind of been interested in the you know, in the kind of in the conceptual rather than the empirical, in a sense, then that's the kind of thing the space of possible minds is. So that's what I'm really interested in. And then consciousness is particularly interesting because we have this intuition that that maybe, and it's the intuition that Thomas Nagel you know, really grasps and plays on in What Is It Like to Be a Bat, which I really radically disagree with a lot of things in What Is It Like to Be a Bat, and in a sense the whole kind of conclusion, the whole message of the paper. But I think it's the most brilliant question, and it raises, you know, it really you know, what's the word, activates that intuition that we feel that there could be these forms of consciousness that are really different from ourselves, or there could be creatures that are really different from ourselves but are still consciousness in ways that we couldn't possibly understand. And so that's where this phrase conscious exotica comes from. Is like, so I'm interested in that question. Can there be you know, what might consciousness be like in beings that are very different from ourselves? And so those beings would be conscious exotica. And so I think the octopus is a great example where I think, you know, now I think a lot of people will agree that the octopus is kind of conscious in certain ways. There's lots of behavioral evidence, or, you know, in the kinds of documentaries and stuff that I was talking about earlier on, and there's lots of scientific evidence from the neuroscience. So, but they're pretty exotic on the scale of things, but they're really not that exotic if we think about, you know, if we think about, well, could plants be conscious? Could planets be conscious? Or, you know, could AI be conscious? And you know, could beings that evolved elsewhere in the universe be conscious? So I think it's a very interesting question. You know, what might conscious exotica be like? And then, but from a kind of Wittgensteinian point of view, it actually is questionable whether the question really, properly speaking, makes sense. So that's where it gets really interesting, and that's where the void of inscrutability comes in. But that's a whole other thing.
But let's go into that. I mean, what happens when you take this Wittgensteinian route and go into it?
Yeah, so I wrote this paper in 2016 called Conscious Exotica, which came out in Eon magazine, It's not a proper, peer-reviewed publication, but for me, it's one of the kind of things I'm most happy about that I've written in my career, because I think it really asks, if I say so myself, a deep and important question, and also, for me, it was like, how can I reconcile this intuition that there could be things that are conscious in ways that we can never understand or never have access to? How can I reconcile that with my Wittgensteinian sensibilities, which kind of, which reject the sort of dualistic implications of that, because there are sort of dualistic implications there, that there is this kind of realm of, metaphysical sort of realm of the subjective, or of subjective experience, and that, that it's, some parts of it are inaccessible to us, and that's a profoundly un-Wittgensteinian kind of thought in many ways. And so how do I reconcile those two things? And I think, well, it's really difficult, I think, to reconcile them. But I think one thing that you do, one sort of conclusion that you arrive at, is that there's a sense in which, if something is that, is that exotic, is that different from us, that we really cannot understand it at all, then the concept of consciousness is just not applicable, because it's our concept, it's our word, it's the way we use the word, and it's not. I don't think it's pointing at something out there. It's a tool that we use, and it's very difficult to get over the intuition that there's something out there that is there's a fact of the matter, and there's a thing in itself which is the subjective experience. It's really hard to not to fight that intuition, but I think that that's the right thing to do.
And when I wrote the note, Ex Machina, Consciousness Exotica, my first thought was, when you look at the space of possible minds, it's going to become clear that these AI models, these large language models, are slowly going to progress into an AGI that's going to give us a new space of possible minds. And
yes,
what are your thoughts on this? What are the philosophical implications of this topic?
Yeah. I mean, I think the philosophical implications are really, really fascinating. Because I mean, the phrase that I've used in one of my papers is that they're exotic mind-like entities, and I'm really thinking of the things that are already around today. They're sort of exotic mind-like entities. So I call them mind-like, because I don't want to necessarily actually give them full mindhood necessarily, but I mean, to call them mind-like entities, I can get away with that, right? Without I can be sort of sitting on the fence there.
It reminds me of Michael Levin when he says proto-cognitive.
Proto-cognitive, yeah.
So,
yeah. So are they well, are they proto minds? Maybe they are sort of proto minds. I mean, but I think I like mind-like entities. So I think we already have these exotic mind-like entities, and I think one of the biggest challenges is for us to figure out what's the right way to talk about them. And in many ways, I think our existing folk psychological concepts that we apply to each other, and to understand and talk about each other, and also about other animals, they're sort of only loosely applicable to these large language models. And that's really interesting and challenging, because I mean, the thing is that they exhibit this peculiar pattern of successes and failures of cognitive abilities. So I mean, a great case in point is reasoning. People are arguing right now on Twitter as we speak about can large language models reason, and you've got the yes camp and the no camp, and they're all very angry with each other. But I think that the part of the problem there is that we're stuck with a concept that we think about it's the way it applies to humans, and it's not directly applicable to large language models. So I think that the truth is that they kind of reason. They're not very good at some kinds of reasoning. They're not very good at like complicated multi-hop reasoning, but then again, neither are humans, but kind of dumb computers actually can do that stuff quite well, interestingly. I mean, humans are kind of like flawed when it comes to various, forms of reasoning, as like Daniel Kahneman pointed out all kinds of ways in which we make mistakes. And I think the interesting thing is that large language models, at the moment, they make their own kind of, somewhat different pattern of mistakes. And so people can point to examples where they make completely stupid seeming mistakes that no child would make, and they say, "Oh, look, that means they can't reason." But in fact, that they are that that it's a particular kind of flaw that you see in large language models that you don't see in humans. But then there are other respects in which they clearly do perform reasoning like behavior. So again, I think it's another example of where our existing vocabulary maybe needs to be kind of altered and bent into a slightly different shape.
I often agree with that sentiment. I think that linguistically we're very, very limited to, and it's quite difficult for us to pin down and explain these phenomena using what we have as a language at this point. I brought that up with Noam Chomsky once, and he disagreed. He felt that we actually do have all of the capabilities. But defining these concepts, it probably is possible. But I don't think so. I think that it is quite difficult. Like merely trying to differentiate and define mind from consciousness is already such a big job. I don't know if this is something we
Yeah.
can do.
Yeah, I mean, so did Chomsky? So he thought that we, as it were, we had our current conceptual framework was adequate for all of
I
that.
think my question to him at the time was, this was about 2 years ago, so I might be wrong, but I think I asked him, do you think if we had a better language system that incorporated more semantics, allowed us to just use more punctuations and give us far more information, would we be able to answer these questions then? And I think his answer was along the lines of not really. He thinks that already what we have might suffice. I could be wrong. I need to rewatch that.
Right, sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm thinking of is more, just inventing new concepts and new vocabulary, the sort that humanity has done forever. And indeed, sometimes we import concepts and vocabulary from other cultures and other languages, and that's because we just don't quite have the right thing in English, say, so we can import a Japanese term or something, a Japanese concept for something. And so and of course we're all the time inventing and refining our vocabulary, even in this sort of space, like the concept of the unconscious was it certainly didn't exist in its current form 200 years ago. And so I think some movement like that of in our vocabulary is probably going to be in order for us to be able to speak about and think about large language models better.
I think it's even when we think about us being conscious all the time. I know there's this one great quote by Marvin Minsky where he says something along the lines of, we will never be able to build a computer that is conscious of itself. However, it's not like we're conscious of ourselves most of the time anyway. So that's something I found really funny. The fact is that we go around thinking that we're always conscious of what's going on, but for the most part, we are unconscious, as you just said, or on autopilot.
Yes, yeah. Well, also, not just that, but also I think there's this another philosophical intuition, which is that we have some kind of privileged access to our own consciousness. And of course, there is a kind of sense in which we have privileged access to our own consciousness because I'm me, and you're not me, and you're you, and that gives us a privileged access in a sort of non-mysterious sense, in that I have privileged access to what's in my space around me right here, right now, that you don't have, because I can see this table, for example. So there's a kind of non-mysterious sense of privileged access going on there, and that's fine. But then usually, philosophers have a much deeper and more mysterious sense of privileged access when they talk about the direct access we have to our own experience, and there's another verbal trick that tends to go on there, which is of thingifying or reifying experience, which is turning it into this thing and talking about it in a certain way as if it's a thing, which then is then that problematizes it and raises all kinds of questions about what's the relationship between that thing and this thing, you know, and then you get into a tangle. And but the mistake is to thingify experience in the first place.
Have you, Mario, you familiar with the work done by Michael Graziano?
Yes, I am to an extent. The attention schema.
Yes. I
approach
find
to
his work very fascinating when it comes to exactly that, this reifying of experience, or looking at someone or some sort of a being that is human-like. He does a lot of these cool experiments where he shows if someone's looking at something and you get a third person to sort of discuss what that thing is going to do, they would say it's tilting away from the person merely because someone's got a gaze on them. Because we have
Right.
innate, instinctive ability to assume that something is propagating out of us, and that consciousness.
Right.
It's almost
Right.
inescapable
Right.
in a sense. So if you put someone behind a tilting object, if someone's maybe standing here, you would think, the person would think that you're actually putting a force field to sort of hold this thing up as well. And it's
Right.
crazy because we can't escape these almost instinctive abilities. And that
Yeah.
leads
Yeah.
to most of the dualistic theories that we have, just unintentionally.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean that makes good sense to me, and I like the way that in his work. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm super familiar with it, but kind of broadly familiar with it. That he sort of inverts this this sort of privileged relationship by sort of saying, you know, our understanding of others comes first, and then we apply that to ourselves.
Yes.
And I mean, that's a very crude characterization, I'm sure he would say of his position, but something, you know, I think he's saying something along those lines, and you know, I think something like that is sort of right. Yeah.
Yeah, his work is a lot on the social brain, you're right. And in his Rethinking Consciousness, he even says attention schema theory could be thought of as a great theory that can prop onto global workspace theory, and it's almost together even better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're a
Yeah.
fan of global workspace theories. I wanted to get
I
us
am.
along the line.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I've long been a fan of global workspace theory. Excuse me. Um, and you know, I've often thought actually that these different theories that people sometimes think are incompatible with each other are not really incompatible. And
Mm.
I agree. I cannot see any incompatibility really between Graziano's ideas and Bernie Bars's. To be honest, I
He
think
agrees. Yeah.
I think they're quite compatible. But I also think that there's a compatibility. There's more and some, you know, I know a lot of people would agree with this. There's a more compatibility between integrated information theory and global workspace theory than some people would say, including Tononi would definitely deny that, and Christoph Koch, I think, they would deny that. But they you know, have this whole metaphysical set of metaphysical commitments that for them goes with the theory, which I think are kind of optional. I think the idea of you know, of an information theoretic measure that kind of assesses the balance of integration and discrimination in a system is you know, I think that's a really important kind of idea, and clearly is related, I would say, to consciousness, and clearly it seems to me that the global workspace architecture promotes this kind of balance of, you know, integrated activity and segregated activity, you know, in the brain, and so you know, I think that they're actually more compatible than people think, and I think quite a lot of researchers like would agree with that. Like Anil Seth, for example, I think would agree with that point of view. Anil and I would not agree about everything by any means, but I think we'd agree on that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which approach do you think would best help us understand and differentiate between these spaces of possible minds? Which neuroscientific or any sort of,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, so I do. So I think, you know, we should be paying more attention to behavior. And that no, I'm certainly not a behaviorist, by not at all, because I think what's going on inside is really important, and to understand brains and is really important, and a kind of like maybe a naive version of behaviorism would reject that. But I think that we kind of maybe go a bit too far the other way of sort of not thinking about behavior very much at all when we're thinking about consciousness from a scientific point of view. I mean, for example, I was at ASSC, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, their annual conference, which was in Tokyo a couple of months ago. I used to go very frequently to that conference, but I haven't been for a few years. And it was interesting to go there because I was having this thought about behavior, and I thought it was notable how few discussions there were that talked about behavior in the context of consciousness. It's all about looking at, brain activity, looking at, what's going on inside brains, and really not a lot about behavior. Now, by contrast, if you go to animal cognition meetings, and when people get onto the topic of consciousness, then they're very interested in behavior. So they're for them, like often the relevant markers are very much behavioral. And so I think behavior is super important. And again, it kind of aligns with my Wittgensteinian way of thinking, is that the way on an everyday level that we use the word conscious is we're not looking inside people's brains, we're looking at their behavior.
In the context of machine learning and AI, how do you see the role of embodied cognition influencing the development of more sophisticated AI models?
Yeah. So I mean, so if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have given a much more forceful answer about the importance of embodiments. I would have said, I can't imagine us being able to build, AGI, or really build sophisticated, human comparable cognition into a machine, unless it was in an embodied context, and where I would allow for virtual embodiment. So embodiment in some games, like in 3D environment, is would fit the bill. But for me, it was really important. I saw it as really important for developing a kind of common sense understanding of the everyday world, that takes place in the everyday world, with its spatially distributed objects and so on, and all the properties and things that come along with that. And so obviously other animals are they exist in this 3D world, and they're very much embodied, and their cognition is very much comes from that. And we, as I would see it, our human cognition builds on top of that kind of animal level of cognition. And language, which, if you think of as a kind of pinnacle of cognitive ability, is built on that foundation of embodied interaction with the ordinary everyday world. But along come large language models and somewhat throw a spanner into those works, because there you have a very persuasive evidence that we can build some pretty sophisticated mind-like entities that are, in the important sense that I'm thinking about, disembodied. They don't have bodies in the sense that I'm talking about here. By the way, some people seem to think when I say disembodied there, they say, oh, but they have a physical they're physically realized in data centers. No, that's not what I mean by embodied, kind of obviously, but anyway, I don't mean they're immaterial. I mean they don't exist in these bits of flesh or metal, if we're robots, and move around in this world of physical objects like we do, and manipulate it. So manipulate that world and the objects in it. So anyways, but so I feel like I've had to kind of backtrack a little bit on that intuition, which is great, because the way we progress in our thinking is by being wrong, which is that's great. People are always right and not making any progress in their lives. So that's been very interesting insight to discover that. But I do still think that in order to maybe get much further, then embodiment's going to have to come back into the equation at some point. We're going to see the the limitations of the things that we've got, and at the very least, you need to make things multimodal, which we already do. You have visual input to large language models, to more to generative AI to these large models, and so that's an important step in the right direction. And then if we start to make them more agentic, as people call it, so capable of acting, and then acting in the world, and maybe driving robots and so on, then I think we will start to move more and more towards an embodied setting, and I suspect that would be necessary in order to go very much further.
You wrote Embodiment and the Inner Life in 2010, I think, eh?
Yeah, it was published in 2010, yeah.
And then Ex Machina came out in 2012.
2015, I think. 2015.
If you guys were remaking that film now, what would you change?
Yeah.
With the knowledge we have of ChatGPT, the way the world's working.
Yeah.
It would be. I'm fascinated to know what that movie would be like today.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I'm not sure I'd want to change anything about Ex Machina.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's say you were making a new film.
Making a new film. Yeah. Okay. Well, so this is, here's a confession that goes along with the other one about being wrong. Is that so Ex Machina came out shortly after Spike Jonze's film Her, and at the time I really didn't like Her. I thought I mean, and one of the reasons was I just thought that we're not going to be able to build those kinds of things in this sort of disembodied way. I mean, we don't really know how it's actually built there, but the manifestation of it is a disembodied kind of manifestation just in the phone. So I was a bit skeptical about the lack of embodiment there, but I was even more skeptical about the idea that people could develop these relationships with this kind of disembodied AI. I thought, God, really? I just didn't think it was very plausible. I mean, how wrong could I have been? I mean, I really misjudged humanity there. I feel so. So with hindsight, I think. No, I still think Ex Machina is of course the better film, but nevertheless, I have to admit that I was wrong about Her, and with hindsight, it was a great film, and it was prescient in a way that Ex Machina is not yet prescient. I still think Ex Machina dealt with the philosophical questions and brought up philosophical questions, maybe better than Her did, but certainly Her seems to have is more relevant in some ways to more directly, right? Just because of the the format of the AI. It's in this disembodied sort of setting. But anyways, but that doesn't quite address your question, but sort of, I guess. So
and I think one of the quite a cool philosophical scenario in Her is towards the very end, where this entity, they all get together and then just leave us all. We don't know what the hell is going on. Where are they? What's it?
Right.
That's I think pretty deep philosophical question.
I agree, and that was one. I thought towards the end of the film that then he certainly brought up some much deeper issues. I mean, there's the great line where who is it? Joaquin Phoenix is the actor, right? It says, "Oh, so how many people are you in love with?" And she says, "Oh, currently, 4,220 or something like that." And which I thought was a great line. I mean, there's a line in Ex Machina in the script where which I thought was a really, really great line, which is the bit where Nathan it says, well, we're not doing a Turing test. The point here is because in the Turing test you can't see which is the AI, but here we show you that you can see that she's a robot, and the point is to see whether you still think she's conscious. So I call that the Garland test rather than the Turing test, because I think it's a completely different test. And when in the script that I wrote spot on at that bit, because I thought it was such a great line. And I really think that Alex kind of almost invented, or certainly articulated, a completely new test in that line in that film.
Yes.
And other people use that as an example of this now, and call it the Garland test. But anyway, in Her, I think that was the line where if I'd read the script, I would have written spot on, with the bit where she says, "Oh, I'm talking to, like, I'm in love with 4,000," because then suddenly the alienness of the AI is suddenly exposed, and that was a great moment, I think, in the film.
That's often how I feel when I read more about plants and the way they communicate with each other, and how it takes thousands of years for this communication to even happen. And it's a form of intelligence we just don't understand because of the
No,
complexity
right.
and the scale. And that's when you realize how alien this intelligence really is to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think plants are so in my work. I've got this concept of engineering an encounter. So if you really, in order for, so the arguments, or the thought goes like this, that in order for something exotic to even be a candidate for using the vocabulary of consciousness, then it at least needs to be possible for us to engineer an encounter with a thing. So it needs to at least be possible for us to think what it would be like to inhabit the same world as that thing. So in the case of the octopus, we can do it for real. Yeah, Peter Godfrey Smith can put on his scuba gear and dive and play with the octopuses. So it's relatively easy to engineer an encounter. Now with plants, it's really not. It's really hard. Now we can sort of we imagine it. I mean, if you could sort of slow down times for us, and so it just has to be, you have to be able to imagine it, and that bestows candidature on the being. It doesn't, so we can sort of imagine, I guess, slowing down our time, but then we'd have to kind of probably change our body as well, and in some way that is really sort of hard to imagine. So I think we're really on the edge of the void of inscrutability here, when we ask the question of whether plants are conscious or not.
Do you think that the best approach for us to deal with AI, or whatever AGI comes in the future, is to sort of fuse with it and become embodied with this system somehow?
I mean, I'm not sure I entirely. I'm not sure I feel very attracted to that idea personally myself. I'm definitely not a transhumanist, and I'm not drawn to that, particularly to that kind of idea. I have to say no.
I mean, we're technically already there if you think about it, Murray. Everything we do is so intertwined with technology at this point. I feel like it's going to happen either way.
Yeah, I suppose it depends what you mean by fusing with it. If you, I
Yes.
mean, what did you mean by what have you got in
Well,
mind?
I was taking it. I would say taking it slower, but I was going to the extreme of, let's say, a neural link type of.
Mm.
Yeah, well, I was going for the extreme.
Yeah. No, so for me, no, definitely, I think I'd rather. Uh, well, I'm very liberal in I wouldn't want to prevent other people or whole societies, if they wanted to, from kind of doing that kind of thing, I suppose. But I'd quite like there to be space for us, for the rest of us, to
Yeah.
kind of carry on as usual. Keep calm and carry on. But it might be difficult for that to happen.
It's a very scary future to know somebody has the ability to hack your brain at some point. That's probably the most terrifying thing I could think of.
Yeah, I would rather that we didn't go in that direction, for sure.
No, me too. How do you see the field of AI and cognitive science evolving over the next decade? And where would you
Yeah,
like to see it go?
I mean, I've sort of long ago, even before the advent of large language models, learned to avoid those sorts of questions. So, I mean, as you probably know, I did write this book called The Technological Singularity, and
Yes.
I mean, I'm definitely no Ray Kurzweil. I'm not. This is not. I'm not, advocating or championing the idea or making predictions about when it's, that it's near or anything like that. So in that book, which I kind of slightly regret writing because people take it the wrong way, but the book was just meant to be a kind of which is meant for a kind of a fairly general readership, and it's meant to be a kind of introduction to the conceptual territory and to be kind of neutral about it, in many respects. And one of the things I say right at the beginning in the preface is that I'm not going to engage in futurology and kind of guess whether this will happen or when it would happen and so on. So even back then, that was 2015 that came out. But so even back then, I was avoiding these sorts of questions. And now I think with the hindsight of the last 2 years, I even more want to avoid those sorts of questions, because I did not see well, of course I saw large language models coming, but what I didn't see coming was the capabilities that they have, these sort of emergent capabilities. So that really did come out of the, come sort of out of the blue. I did not see that coming until about 2020, when when GPT-3 came out. Then I could sort of see the writing on the wall a bit.
Yeah, it's exponential since then as well. It's kind of scary at how fast it's growing.
Yeah, I mean, it may be, things may be plateauing a bit at the moment, but I mean, I do tend to think, I'm not sure who's saying is it that we often overestimate the impact of things in the short term and underestimate the impact of things in the long term. And I think that there might be, there might be a case of that here. I think there's been a lot of hype, and I imagine that's going to die down a bit. But I think there will be a huge impact. Exactly what it's going to be, I don't know, but over the next 10 years or so.
I've got a good way to go around that first question, and to say the best futurists are possibly science fiction writers. If you look at that we read over time, I mean, who would be some of your favorite authors, and what are your favorite books when it comes to sci-fi?
Science fiction. Oh, well, William Gibson.
He's one of my favorites as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge William Gibson fan, and Neuromancer, when it came out. I mean, I'm a proud owner of a first edition. It's quite valuable of Neuromancer. And when it came out, I thought it was just, and of course Blade Runner came out about the same time. But the whole cyberpunk thing I thought was absolutely great, and it was far more kind of. I mean, I know that I think William Gibson will be the first to deny that he's trying to make predictions, as well. But he has been by far I think the most accurate, of predictors, among science fiction writers. And I mean, one of the things about it was that technology wasn't something that was in labs and in kind of government things. It was like messy stuff on the street that kind of ordinary people hacked around with, and that's so accurate, and I think in many ways. So anyway, yeah, William Gibson, a huge William Gibson fan. A bit earlier than that, Asimov's I, Robot stories had a huge influence on me as a kid, and they're really what got me into the whole field. So yeah, huge respect for those.
Any philosophers or scientists that you believe should be must reads for anyone watching or listening?
Well, of course, Wittgenstein, of course. Everybody should read the Philosophical Investigations, but it's really hard. I think it's really hard to understand, to be honest. If I were to recommend one book to understand Wittgenstein, probably would be Ray Monk's biography, actually, which is like a masterpiece. Scientists. So what scientists do I really admire? Well, actually, another Gibson, J.J. Gibson, who was the person who introduced the concept of affordances as we sort of have it today. So his book, An Ecological Theory of Perception, an Ecological View of Perception, I forget the exact title, but that's an absolutely brilliant book in many ways. I don't know why that came to mind specifically just then, but I'm have long been very, very interested in animal cognition. So there are a lot of amazing animal cognition and developmental psychology as well. So there are a lot of amazing writers in that space out there. like Nikki Clayton, for example, has done all this amazing work with birds in the animal cognition space. I'm a huge admirer of her work. Then Alison Gopnik and Liz Spelke have done work that's had a huge impact on me as well in the developmental psychology area. George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By. Oh, there's one that I absolutely have to include. So that book, again, I mean, that's 1987, I think, so an old book, but that book had an enormous impact on me, just showing how our whole way of thinking and our language is completely infused with kind of metaphors that come down to very fundamental things like journeys and containers and battles and things. And there's a handful of concepts which are very, very basic, that we apply to everything, even to the highest level of abstraction. And so that book was an amazing eye-opener, and I just could not. I mean, as soon as you start thinking about this, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. I mean, even in the phrase "an eye-opener," the phrase. I mean, George Lakoff could write a whole kind of page on that phrase applied in that setting, an eye-opener. And it's we think about our minds as in terms of seeing things, and so our understanding of concepts is a very abstract thing, and yet we use all these metaphors to do with vision to do with it. So that's one that just literally just arose as I started reflecting. There's another one. You just on my own sentence just then, right?
That reminds me of, I'm not sure, I'm not sure if this is true, but I've spoken to a few guests about it, where blind patients don't seem to suffer from schizophrenia. So this seems to be where they don't have these hallucinations as much. And that makes you wonder how important this visual cortex is when it comes to schizophrenic hallucinations and delusions. So that's sorry, that just came to my mind randomly.
Yeah, definitely outside my expertise.
Murray, any final words? Anything you want to say that you feel like you haven't covered regarding your views on consciousness, the mind, space of possible minds, or anything in the future that you're looking forward to that you'd like to also chat about before?
We haven't talked about role play, actually. So one of the there's one other maybe last thing is that I've been very keen to not to anthropomorphize. I'm saying we shouldn't anthropomorphize large language models and LLM based AI, LLM-based chatbots, and so on. So we shouldn't anthropomorphize them. But on the other hand, it's really hard not to apply our ordinary, everyday folk psychological vocabulary to them. It's like what Dennett calls the intentional stance, and it's really, really difficult not to do that. And indeed, we should do that because it's a powerful tool that we have preloaded into our brains, and for thinking about and talking about each other and our behavior. So I have this paper in Nature last year, which is called Role Play with Large Language Models. And basically what I'm suggesting there is that we can think of large language models as engaging in role play. So if they for example, if they say, I'm worried about being. I mean, you can go them or coax them into saying things like, I don't want to be turned off, or in the case of the famous case of that New York Times journalist, where where Chat GPT, or Bing tried to persuade it to leave his wife because it was in love with him and thought that he should be in love with it. And so I don't think we should think of those things in terms of there being a conscious being there that's actually in love with a New York Times reporter, or indeed that is afraid of being turned off. But I think we can think of these things as role playing those things, which is an understandable. It's understandable that they are good at doing that because there's plenty of examples in their training set of stories involving AIs being threatened with being switched off, and of course lots and lots of stories about people being in love with each other and love triangles and things. So there's plenty of raw material in the training data for them to draw on in playing those roles. So I think that the idea of thinking of large language models in terms of role play is a kind of quite a useful and productive one.
We went in so many tangents regarding Ex Machina and stuff. I actually forgot I have a whole bunch of questions around this topic as well. One of them was, you've discussed goal-directed behavior in general in your work in the context of both humans and AI. How do we model goal setting and goal-oriented actions in artificial systems? And what does this reveal about the nature of motivation and intentionality?
Well, I mean, so with our current generative AI, large language models being the prime example. So they're not particularly, agentic as people to use a slightly dubious word that people are fond of. So they don't. Well, I mean, most current chatbots don't really act in the world in any way apart from issuing responses to the user. Now, maybe they can look things up and do a few things like that now these days, or they can make external calls to, calculators and things, and so that adds a little bit more. So that some people sometimes call that tool use, and so that adds a little bit more agency to them, but it's still very narrow. And at the moment, the idea of generative AI that can kind of set its own goals and then carry through a whole execute a plan and so on. So that's a kind of like, that's at the research end of things. Now there are examples of that. There's some really great work which I really like, came out of Stanford last year, which is showing these generative agents. I think the paper is called, actually. So they have this little Sims, the game Sims that from years back, this sort of Sims-like environment, and you have all these little agents moving around in this environment, and they can interact with each other and in the way that you could in that Sims game from years back. But they're all driven by large language models, basically. So they're all so they can perform actions and in that little world and so on. So they can form plans and carry out the plans and so on. So there's research that's getting there. And one of my colleagues at DeepMind, Joel Lebo, has this system called Concordia, which kind of builds on that work very nicely. But it's a sort of it's at the edge of research at the moment, that kind of thing. So I'm not sure that really answers your question, but it was a rant in the same territory as your question, Matt.
Yeah. How do you approach the challenge of transparency in AI systems, particularly when it comes to understanding and interpreting the internal processes and decision mechanisms of these systems?
Yeah. Well, because that's a great question, and I think it's a really profoundly important scientific question, which is, how do trained neural networks, how do they work? I mean, it's interesting because there's a sense, of course, in which we know exactly how they work. We can trace there's no mystery to the underlying computation at a low level. We can trace through exactly what every neuron is doing and see how its current activation level is a consequence of all the activation levels and the layers below it, and so there's no mystery at that level, obviously. But what we don't understand is how all of that can issue in meaningful behavior. So answering people's questions and talking to them and so on. And so that is a really profoundly important research question. And as I'm sure you know, there's this whole little field has emerged over the last few years called mechanistic interpretability, which is all about trying to unravel how these things work. And that field is very productive and has made a lot of progress. And there are some researchers in Anthropic who've done some really great work along those lines, including very recently. So there's definite there's progress there, but it's difficult, and part of the difficulty is that is that these things are very large. So, there are, billions of neurons and, well, okay, maybe not billions, but there are billions of connections for sure, thousands of millions of neurons, and understanding how all that, or just being able to analyze all of that is, just because of the sheer quantity of individual computational units, is really, really difficult. So it makes the challenge very, very hard. And also, of course, we do know that to some extent the most interesting capabilities do only emerge at scale. So so it makes it a really difficult problem.
You're literally touching on the next question I had, which is emergent properties. How does the concept of emergence inform our understanding of consciousness, and how can it be applied to the development of complex AI systems?
Yeah. Well, there are two separate questions. The second one, I think they're kind of separate questions, and of course, the very concept of emergence is itself, contentious and difficult. And there's one, right at the beginning of this interview, I was kind of railing against definitions but I do think that maybe in this case of emergence, that it's quite useful to pin down some formal definitions for specific cases, which I'm not about to do right now. But there are different people use the word emergent in different senses. But I do think it's a very important concept. And I guess the thing is that the sort of relevant sense here is that there can be abilities of that are that a large system composed of many simple components can exhibit, that it's not obvious how they relate to the abilities of the individual components. The individual components are just neurons that do quite simple mathematical things, just as neurons in the human brain are. Well, actually, they're not all that simple, but relatively speaking, are simple. So we don't, really understand how, from all of these simple units, you can get such rich and complex behavior. And I do think that emergent behavior or emergent capabilities is the right phrase there. The question was, how do we understand that? Well, that's why mechanistic interpretability is such a difficult area, really. I don't know if I knew the answer to that, and that might be my next research agenda.
Yeah, I guess the main thing is, within the context of this podcast and the mind-body problem, is at what point does consciousness emerge from this structure, in a sense?
Well, so again, there's a temptation to think of that question as there being some magic thing that appears at some point and is absent before that, and I'm very resistant to that sort of image of things. So I don't think it I certainly don't think it suddenly emerges along any scale. So you might be looking at complexity or I don't know, number of neurons or something like that. And I suspect that it's not something that suddenly emerges there. And also I don't think it is actually to do with any of those scaly things. It's a funny adjective but you know what I mean. I think you have to take all of those properties, like number of neurons or complexity, and you have to think of them in the context of the behaving being, the behaving animal or the behaving thing. So it comes back to behavior. I don't think you can isolate the thing of interest here from the world in which it's embedded. And that's really important. It comes back to those 4E stuff that we talked about a bit earlier on. So it depends a bit upon there's a feedback loop with an environment, and that's the context in which any of these concepts make sense, I think.
Murray, do you think you're going to write another book in the future?
Yeah, great question. I think I probably will. and you're the first to hear it, because sort of up until very recently, I've been saying I haven't got any plans, and I don't have any, solid plans. But I think I probably will at some point write a book about philosophy, the philosophy of mind, in a kind of in the light of AI, in the light of the AI that we've been able to build. So it's a book I would have loved to have written when I was 21, and because when I was 21, I would have propagated the view. Well, actually failed to propagate the view, but I would have expressed the view that that philosophers ask great questions, but they have terrible answers, and that you really have to look at AI and think about how you would build stuff to think about how you might answer these questions. And indeed, thinking about that kind of throws many philosophers' sort of conventional answers to these philosophical questions. It throws them into some doubt, certainly into a new light. And so I would have said that when I was 21, and nobody would have listened to me. But now I think people might actually listen to me. So, I've had to wait sort of, 35, 40 years. But I mean, so maybe there's a book on that topic there somewhere.
Well, I can't wait for that book to come out. And when it does, I'll be the first to call you in and want to have that chat. Any final words, Murray? Anything else you want to share with the audience before we close off?
I don't think so, but just thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me to prattle on about these things for such a long time.
No, thank you so much for joining me. It's such an honor and privilege to have you, and appreciate all the work you do. Keep it up.
Thank you.
I can't wait to see what happens next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation again.